For many of us, it is the most important commitment to take care of our loved ones. We feed, as the Beatles song goes, and we work hard to ensure that those close to us are thriving. Today, there are 53 million people taking care of their parents, neighbors, and friends. And there are 53 million stories. From the Stanford Center on Longevity, this is When I'm 64, the podcast for caregivers. I'm your host, Ken Stern. Imagine, in your mind's eye, the typical caregiver, bringing medicine, a glass of water, propping up a pillow, offering an encouraging word. Chances are your hypothetical caregiver is a woman. Approximately 60% of the caregivers in the U.S. are women. But what about that other 40%? What about the men across the U.S. who take care of their loved ones? What unique challenges do they face?
For male caregivers, we have to reframe what being a man is. Because I was raised that to be a man, you got to be a stoic financial provider. You're a little bit more hands-off as a caregiver. So I think that's one thing as men would have to face, is that the whole notion of what a man is supposed to be when something like this happens.
That's Ray Casucciano. In 2014, he got a phone call that changed his life. His father, Roger, had suffered a massive stroke. So Ray moved from Los Angeles to his parents' home in St. Louis to become their primary caregiver. Ray and his family immigrated to the U.S. from the Philippines when he was 14 years old.
In the Philippines, it's not surprising to have multi-generational household wherein the grandparents, the parents, and the children all live in one roof, under one roof. And so it was modeled for me then that there are certain responsibilities in taking care of the older generation. It may be that typically it's the female who might take on more role of that, but in our culture, it can be very complicated. Especially as a Asian male caregiver, immigrant, because there are certain expectations that my parents would like to have, because they came over here, sacrificed a lot of things, and they want me to pursue what they were not able to pursue.
When Ray and his family came to the U.S., they moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a tough part of L.A.
My dad was working as a security guard, night shift. So they're working really hard to put food on the table. And that means they're not readily available for me and my sister. But we're lucky to avoid joining gangs, because I know gangs back then are a source of belonging if you didn't know anyone. And so it was a little tough, but I was lucky enough to do well, so that I would be in honors classes, AP classes, and 3 years later I got in to UCLA.
Ray did well at UCLA and went on to get his graduate degree at USC. Eventually, he started his own business called Table Wisdom, connecting older adults with younger students looking to improve their English language skills. When Ray told his friends at work that he had moved to St. Louis to take care of his mother and father, they wondered why he wasn't just putting them in a nursing home.
Quite frankly, nursing homes are quite expensive, and it's not readily accessible for many Americans. And so, besides, the quality of life is much better at home than in an institution. And so, I think having a more direct role was really helpful in making sure that increase the chances that my father would live a longer life after the stroke. At the same time, helping my mom, getting older and not as strong as she was, and so I do still get, sometimes they'll just ask me why just provide the money, and then I would tell them, well, yeah, it's not practical, and it's a better quality of life. It's complicated. It really is. A lot of struggle that I've experienced is usually psychological. What does it mean to be a man? And I grew up again with this Greco-Roman strong types, stoic financial provider, and let the caring or nurturing to the female. But I will challenge them, especially younger caregivers, to think why they think that way. Go back and what are your childhood influences that that brought up this notion, because I think what you will learn is that you can push the boundaries of what being a man should be. It should be grounded in compassion, empathy, and putting others first. Less of quote unquote me, but more of the quote unquote we. And what I did find over this journey is that giving back is much more rewarding, and that I'm aware that my parents made a lot of sacrifices, and I'd like to do what's the right thing to do, which is take care of them at the moment, because that's what's needed.
That's Ray Castucciano, who takes care of his mother and father at their home in St. Louis, Missouri. To help us understand the caregiving journey from a male perspective, we turn to two men who've given this lots of thought. Dr. James Gamboni is a professor who wrote the book Man Enough to Care, and Mark Hyacin is CEO of the company Men Supporting Women with Cancer. Mark incidentally started out his career as a pro baseball player in the Baltimore Orioles farm system, but we'll get to that. So let me start with you, Jim. Mm-hmm. How did you get involved in caregiving? What's your personal caregiving story, and how did it lead to your work in the area?
Well, it's a two-part story, and I'll make it short. I helped care for my grandmother with my mother as my grandmother was suffering what that time was called senility. Today we call it dementia and Alzheimer's. But my real involved caregiving story was helping to support two very good friends of mine, both of whom had wives that were dying from ovarian cancer, and I was part of an intimate part of a support group for them. So that was my personal experiences with caregiving itself, but I was also teaching a class on aging, and one of the women in my class answered a discussion question. We were talking about caregiving on a national level, and she said, "Did you know that 40% of all of the informal caregivers in the country are men?" And I didn't believe her. I'd never seen that before, so I challenged her. And when she provided the proof, then I said to her, and she was the co-author of my book, Who Says Men Don't Care? A Man's Guide for Balanced and Guilt-Free Caregiving. And she and her husband ran a caregiving institute in Florida. And so I said, after this class is over, why don't we look and see what's available for men? And this was in 2010, 2011. And what we found was zero. There was zero books written specifically for male informal caregivers. And so we started on the venture of trying to write a book that was written specifically for men, and that's sort of how I came into the caregiving community and into the caregiving world, and obviously interviewing a lot of different men who were caregivers. And then the last piece is I've been doing generational and intergenerational research and work for the past 26 years, looking at the world through a generational and intergenerational lens. And one of the things that I brought to the book was the fact that men care differently than women, but different generations of men care differently from each other. And so understanding that helps men to become better, I think, caregivers. So long story, but that's how I got into it.
Yeah, so I want to come back to that intergenerational piece in a bit, but before we do that, I want to ask you that little story where your student told you the facts as we all know them now, and you didn't believe her. What didn't you believe? Did you think it was less, much more?
I thought it was much less. Because I think the dominant thinking is that most caregivers are women. And I thought that sort of surprised me because that wasn't my area of expertise, so I didn't do a lot of research. She was much more expert about it than I was. And then when I did the research to verify what she said, I found out she was a little bit off in her statistics. She thought 40%. I've seen between 34 and 40% in terms of the data that's available. So,
Mark, can you sort of share with us? I'm going to ask you the same question because I'm a lazy host. The same question I asked Jim. What brought you've done a lot in your life already? What brought you to caregiving? What's your journey?
Well, my journey began like a lot of other people who became a caregiver for somebody that they love. For me, it was my mom when she was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1992, and those still remain one of the 5 most horrific words I've ever heard is your mom has breast cancer. And as a 29-year-old, quote unquote, air quote, grown man, I felt like a little boy. And my first thought was, oh my God, my mommy was going to die. And I used the word mommy because I felt like a child. And kind of put it in perspective, back in those days, we still had actually car phones. And while my whole family was with my mom when she had her biopsy, I found out that the diagnosis was positive when I was at a meeting. So I took my car phone and immediately just kind of chucked it out of fear and frustration, went right off my dashboard and spidered my windshield. So I thought that was kind of apropos for what I felt like, that my world was just going to be a spider's web with my mom having to deal with breast cancer. And, I was always taught to give back and help others. So what better thing to do than to be there for my mom?
So we're talking today a little bit about caregiving and gender. When did you start thinking about the fact that you were a male caregiver and that was different than most caregivers and what that meant?
I really didn't notice the difference between being a male caregiver and what that meant until we started going to the doctors. And I would see a lot of women by themselves. Again, I grew up in a family where we were always there for each other. So for instance, when my mom went to her doctor's appointment, 95% of the time, the whole family was there, meaning I was there with my wife, my brother was there with his wife, and obviously my father was there as well, always. 100% of the time, she was never by herself. But I think that really brings to what we're talking about, what we're going to be talking about with male caregivers. People think that's unusual, but it shouldn't be. And there are more men out there doing great things that we know about, because unfortunately people want to focus on the knuckleheads that don't step up to the plate. And I understand that, but there are a lot more men doing great things. But back to your question, is when I saw a lot of women by themselves, it really made me sad, because I don't think anybody should have to deal with something as awful and horrible as cancer by themselves.
So both of you have been involved in caregiving for many years as men, obviously enough. But what has changed over the years? When did the norms around caregiving start to change, or when did you observe the idea that it's okay for you to be both a man and a caregiver?
So I think norms have started to change, and I think change for the better. Maybe the last 5 or 10 years, I've noticed a difference. When I first became a caregiver and an advocate and focusing on then the male caregiving component, a lot of it was how we were socialized with, guys have to have a stiff upper lip, put your big boy pants on, you're bleeding a little bit. Okay. Put the Band-Aid on and go back outside and play, make a muscle. Don't show your emotions. It's not good. Keep it inside. Well, every one of those things is not beneficial, for a guy to be a caregiver, and more importantly, for the woman he's a caregiver for, because the emotions that we have, by and large, she wants to hear them from us so they can feel connected. So if they feel connected, if the patient feels connected, and if she knows the person she loves is going to be there for every step of the way, she can then focus on her treatment. I mean, it's common sense. If I have a tough day at work and I can talk to my wife about it, I'm going to feel better about the day and the evening. Well, multiply it times a life sentence of having to deal with cancer potentially, and knowing you have a caring support partner by you, you're going to help increase her quality of survivorship. And at the end of the day, that's the best we can do as a male caregiver.
So, Jim, as you see, how have, from your perspective, things changed over the years? Mark described the difference between his father's generation and his generation. How have you seen things change?
Well, we have now 6 different generations of caregivers in the country, 6 different generations of caregivers. And some of the things that Mark described are absolutely true. You have sort of the lone wolf, which is the older generation. My father was born in 1928, so we're about in the same. Mark and I are from the same generation, and I know how my father looked at these kinds of issues. But we also have. I think what's changed is that there's more of a recognition now that men play a vital role in caregiving, and oftentimes that isn't chosen, as we all know. And there's all different kinds of caregiving relationships that you have to look at. I mean, there's men caring for their mothers, like Mark did. There's men caring for their wives. There's men caring for their parents. There's men caring for their children. There's all of these different roles of caregivers, and we're finally beginning that I've seen over the past, at least in my experience, over the past 10 years of looking at this in a more both personally as well as academically, that there's more of a recognition now that men play a really critical role, especially in the informal, non-paying caregiving role, and that's what I think what we're talking about here. And also understanding, and I'm hoping to bring to this the fact that there are styles of caregiving that men have, and Mark's right. It's not anybody's dictate about what the right style is. The right style is what you need to do and where you need to be in that caregiving situation. But now I think it's important for men to assess sort of their assets and their strengths and liabilities when it comes to that. Otherwise, we all know that when you're in an intense caregiving situation, the most important person in that situation is you, because if you're not there and if you're not healthy and if you're not balanced, you're not going to be able to give the care to that person you love, and likely that person will be worse off unless you do that.
So I'm curious, Mark. You were a former professional athlete, a college athlete. Those are worlds that are, forgive me for calling them macho, or that have sort of elements of, play through the pain.
Yes, I'm a living example of that.
Yeah. So actually, tell us a little bit about that, your own experiences with sports, and how does it make you think different? How do you think differently now than you might have when you were actively, playing professional college ball?
That's a great question. So those traits that made me good also hurt me. So I think if I was able to talk to my younger self, I would say kind of balance it a little bit better, because I'm a living example of I played through the pain and didn't say anything to somebody. I grew up, I think, in that last full generation where if a coach told you to run through a wall, you'd say, "What side of the wall, coach?" And you want me to come back through the other side. And that's the way. My father happened to be a great athlete. He's in the Maryland Softball Hall of Fame, fast pitch and basketball star back in the late 40s. So he was a good athlete. So not only on top of that, I had a dad that knew what he was talking about. But the other part, back to your question, that then I think spilled over to my advocacy. When I got drafted by the Orioles, I was an undersized third baseman. So people would always look at me and say, "Why are you playing third base?" Well, back then I was rated with the major league arm when I was 15, and I had a lot of power because of my backside and my legs, but I was always underestimated. And that kind of fueled me to continue to be better and work harder, because I was always the first one in, last one out. That also hurt me, to your question about playing with the pain. If I had done things differently, I may not have had a shoulder surgery in my career. I had nerve damage in my right shoulder and nobody could diagnose it. By the time they did, one of the muscles in my rotator cuff completely atrophied. Nobody could believe I was playing, but that's the way I was taught. So you mirror that with, as a caregiver, a lot of guys feel that they need to keep everything inside because they don't want to bother the patient with their feelings. What guys need to understand is their feelings matter. Not only do they matter, but she wants to hear them. She wants to feel connected. So the more we can be connected with that person that we love, again, I hate to repeat myself, but the more we're connected, the more she can focus on her treatment. And that's going to increase the quality of survivorship. So I kind of wish younger Mark knew a little bit more what older Mark was going to do, and he might have played baseball a little bit longer.
All right. Well, so Jim, you don't get to say ditto to what Mark says.
I say ditto to what Mark said.
So Jim, I mean, this is actually the meat of the conversation in some ways. Why doesn't society credit men? You yourself wasn't aware of sort of the substantial role, even if it's a minority role, still a substantial minority role that men play in caregiving. Why is it that society continues to perhaps not fully acknowledge the roles that men are playing increasingly in caregiving?
I think it's probably for a lot of different reasons. Ken, I think that men generally have been stereotyped into certain roles. I mean, we're stereotyped into being the provider, right? We're stereotyped into being strong. We're stereotyped into being rational and less emotional. We have a lot of male stereotypes that are there, and I think, unfortunately, in the if we look at how women have challenged some of the stereotypes that they've encountered and how they've dealt with them, men have not done that as much as women have, and so men sort of just push a lot of that stuff aside. I do. I push a lot of that stuff aside and say, okay, that's fine. I don't really care about that because I'm going to do what I need to do and be the person that I need to be for the person I'm caring for. So I think it's a societal lack of understanding of who men are and the capabilities that men have. I think that's what's changed for me. I've seen some changes in that over the past 15 or 20 years of my life. I've seen, as Mark has seen, I think there's been some change. I hope that programs like this can help raise awareness about the need for looking at men differently and what men can offer. We have a tremendous amount to offer here, and it's very undervalued, but, we can surprise people.
It's really important. I mentioned in the beginning that people think about what we're doing, what Jim's doing as unique. It shouldn't be. It should be the norm, because there's nothing more normal and natural than being there for people you love. My mom didn't raise her hand, say, can I have breast cancer? As a son, it was my turn to give back to her. And that's what we do. It's family being there. There's nothing more important. And again, kind of hokey, but I still think we can make a difference if, we stayed in our area and let it build out.
Well, thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
That's Mark Hyerson, founder and CEO of Men Supporting Women with Cancer. We also spoke with Dr. Jim Gamboni, author of the book, Man Enough to Care. If you want to learn more about Mark's caregiver advocacy organization, go to mensupportingwomenwithcancer.org. When I'm 64 is produced by Carrie Thompson and Ava Ahmed Begi. Support for the Stanford Center on Longevity comes from the Annenberg Foundation, dedicated to addressing the critical issues of our time through innovation, community, compassion, and communication. Please like us on iTunes and leave us a review. You can find out more about us by visiting our website, longevity.stanford.edu. You've been listening to When I'm 64, the podcast for caregivers. I'm your host, Ken Stern.